Well, I have a confession to make. 17 years later, I realize I made a mistake at my wedding, and we're going to discuss that today's episode of Fearless. Well, yes, before we get into the conversation of the mistake I made on my wedding, I just want to say thank you to everyone who downloaded the Fearless voting guide this fall. I am just so thankful. Over 60,000 of you got a copy of the Fearless voting guide, which means there's a lot more listeners to hear on Fearless. So welcome to the Fearless family, and welcome to today's episode of Fearless. And of course, we were discussing really tough topics these last couple of weeks and months. We hit it hard. So I want to once again say thank you to all who just stayed with me, who bared through those tough conversations. They're not always the most fun to talk about. And so today I realized, I needed something a little bit different, or to have people around me, maybe to lighten the load for us a little bit here on Fearless. And I've asked my producer here in Fearless, Casey Helmick, to help me, and my good friend, Julie Lyles-Carr. Julie helps me on different various projects. And so these are two people in my life and who are on the background of Fearless, who I bounce ideas off, who we do a lot of brainstorming with. So I've asked them to join me today on Fearless to be on this side of the mic. Welcome, Casey and Julie.
Thanks for having us.
I'm glad to be here, Cissie.
I know y'all are so thrilled and so excited. Casey just looks like she's so just bursting with excitement.
I asked my wife this morning, I'm like, I have to be on a podcast this morning, which I never do. What do I wear? So forgive me for dressing down. You all are all dazzled up with the Christmas tree in the background, but here we are.
Like I said, I've realized I've been married 17 years this next month. December 31st, New Year's Eve is Corey and I's anniversary. I think it's 17 years, not 18, but 17 we're going to go with. And I realized this past week that I made a mistake at my wedding, and we're going to talk about that. So my kids and I, or my family, was invited to go to a good family friend's wedding. And I was shocked when they said that the kids could come, because I started thinking like, when do kids ever get invited to a wedding? And my first reaction was, no, I don't want them to come. I want to go have a night away from the kids and have fun and dance and eat good food and not just be pulled in many directions with kids. And I began to think that kids in our culture, in the American culture, if we want to say, never get invited to a wedding. And I mean, I have a daughter who's 11 years old. She was in a wedding once as a flower girl, I think at 3. But Austin, who's 8, he's never been to a wedding. And he actually started asking me questions about a wedding. What do you do at a wedding? What do you? And I realized there's never a time where kids get to witness the design of marriage and life for a family, for a nuclear family. And then I started asking questions. Well, is that only in the American culture? Is that only in the Christian American culture? So anyways, that is the topic of discussion, because I did not invite kids to my wedding. I didn't want there to be a distraction. And quite frankly, it was very expensive. I didn't want more mouths to feed. But I started Googling this issue, and we're going to dive into that. But it's like, what do other communities, what do other cultures do when it comes to children and valuing children when it comes to weddings?
Well, I had kids in my wedding.
That's good. That's good, because 17 years later, I realized I made a mistake. Now, you got to understand though, Cissie, I'm always looking for the comedic factor, right? Like, I think there's nothing more hilarious than kids at a wedding. I think that there are beautiful reasons to include kids, but I think you can always depend on the kids to bring a level of comedy. And the kids at my wedding did. We had my second cousin. He was little bitty at the time. And then I had my news producers. I was in television then. His 2 daughters came and were part of the wedding. And they took their little Matchbox cars that we'd given them to distract them, and they drove them all over the back of my dress. And they were so fascinated. And when it came time for the kiss, we really have a really cute picture of them leaning around each other to see the kiss at the end of the wedding. But to your point, I didn't realize at the time that was more unusual. And in later years, when it came to our family and being invited to weddings, now, it's fair to say that if you were to invite all of my crew, it'd be super expensive. Whenever we do go to weddings with all of us, it's a lot. But I do think that it was interesting because at the time, again, I just thought it'd be so fun and it'd be so funny to have kids involved. But you're right. I do get those invitations these days that say, hey, no children, please don't bring the kids, leave the kids at home. So I think that really is more the trend these days. And I was wondering if I was the only one. So actually, what do you do when you're curious about a subject? You Google.
You Google, yeah.
And I cannot tell you how many articles came up about this issue, but how many of them were talking about the American culture. And I read an article about Italian weddings and how they value children. And just to your point, the joy and the love and the excitement that they bring to a wedding. You know, I've talked about here on Fearless before, the Mormon families and how inspiring they can be and their love for one another. And some influencers I follow, these Mormon families, it's always about the family. The family is central to their life and the kids at these weddings. But I also read, you know, a Jewish article that said a Jewish wedding is a joyous celebration and an example to children and how traditions are passed down and updated along the way. And then I read a comment, I can't remember what it was on, and it says, I honestly think no kids at weddings is a very American or Western idea. In other cultures, there is more of a focus on the marriage and what it means for the families. And I think kids at weddings are important for kids too, for kids to be able to see that, to see weddings, love, healthy relationships. So I've just have been curious is, you know, what happens when we remove that from kids, that we don't allow them to experience life? We don't see, we don't pass down those traditions to our children. What does that teach them?
Well, and we don't remove it from them. We remove what probably is the right way for them to see it. But frankly, like our kids are watching TV shows, they're talking to their friends, they're experiencing weddings at different levels, they're experiencing marriage at different levels from other people, maybe people like, you know, a Mormon show that they see on TV or something like that. And so it is a little silly as not just American culture, but maybe even in American Christian culture that we hold marriage and a wedding day so high that we almost like protect it for ourselves from disruptions from kids. And yet then we send them out to experience other cultures that we may not be aligned with. And I know we're supposed to be a lighthearted show here today, but that, like as a parent, that scares me that my child might have learned more about what the meaning behind a wedding is from a TV show than from things I've helped them experience. What do you do? I guess I'd throw a question to this group. What do we do if a wedding comes up into your world, Cissie, now? And what do you do with your kids? You know, what steps can you take to, whether they're invited or not, use that moment to show them what marriage is, what a wedding is?
Yeah. So we had to have those discussions with my kids. And to back up a little bit, my kids had the best time at this wedding. And to Julie's point, my little Georgia Graham, who's almost 2, was in the center of the dance floor for the entire night. And everybody's dancing. She's going up to complete strangers. And we do forget that kids bring joy and they bring innocence, and there's a value in that. And so I wanted my kids to see all that. And we have to say, it might have been one of the best weddings we've ever been to because family was involved. It was small. It was classy and beautiful and elegant, yet comfortable with fire pits and s'mores and a hot chocolate bar. So my kids were in heaven, and Austin could have free Sprite. But to Casey's point, teaching kids, you know, if we don't fill that gap in talking about these issues and showing them how God beautifully designed marriage, when we live in a culture, as we've talked about here in Fearless before, that is constantly attacking the nuclear family. And man, Satan has just been on a warpath when it especially comes to Christian marriages inside the church. And so I think it's important for kids to see that the different milestones in life. And just this week, they went to a wedding, but the grandmother of the bride, who's a very dear family friend, is very sick and in the hospital. And these could be her last days where she's nearing heaven. And I took my kids to go see her. It's important that we don't shelter kids in that kind of way. I think it's important for kids to see people that we know and we love that are gracefully nearing heaven. We talked about a wedding on one day, and the next day we talked about what it looks like to pass into heaven.
And by the way, isn't it funny? I don't know if this is an American culture thing or across the globe, but we try to make that wedding day so perfect, and yet it's headed towards a marriage that is destined to not be perfect, right? Mm-hmm. And by not inviting kids, I think the general premise is let's try to make the day as perfect as possible for the couple, which is fine. But isn't it beautiful to see, for our kids to see, like, the wedding day is not going to be perfect, the marriage isn't going to be perfect, and we're all just going to keep rolling with the punches and committed to the start and the continuation and the finish of these things, like you just said. So it's kind of funny that we've tried to perfect something that leads to a relationship that needs like constant care and comedy added to it and all the things. I think that is a very American way of looking at it.
It is. And we put, and maybe to my point, kids were really expensive, you know, to feed. A wedding in general is so expensive. Flowers to invitations to food. And when you look at the cost per person, you're like, oh, where can I cut people out? But that just shows where are our priorities. Our priorities in, you know, keeping up with the Joneses and having this kind of wedding and having these kind of flowers or this kind of food. Where can we cut it to where we really reevaluate our values to where we do want to include family and not to worry about if things are perfect, if a baby's going to cry out during the ceremony. And I'm saying all this because I was guilty. I was that 21-year-old bride who had this perfect image in her head. And little did I realize very quickly on my honeymoon, I was going to realize marriage isn't perfect, to Casey's point. And very quickly do you enter those hardships in marriage and you have to come through them. So,
which, by the way, funny story is I believe we had children at our wedding. I don't remember.
I don't remember either.
There.
I was at your wedding, but I can't remember.
I believe we did. And the one story of someone who did something that really made people go, ugh, was actually from my wife's grandfather, who pretty much demanded we had a chocolate fountain at our wedding and then went downstairs before everybody else and stuck his finger in the chocolate fountain, not thinking that would be highly inappropriate for everyone else. And that's the story I remember.
Who caught him?
Oh, we got down there just in time to see him covered in chocolate. But you know, like, if our goal is to make it perfect and disruption free, then let's not invite anybody. Like, just go the two of you off, you know? And I think that road's a really dangerous road to go down, where you're picking and parsing out things that aren't for the good of the community that God's placed you in. They're good for you, but maybe not for this moment that God wants all of us to probably be a part of in some way. So, you know, you could make a case that kicking the kids out, you know, maybe we should kick grandpa out too, just in case there's a chocolate fountain.
Hopefully grandpa washed his hands.
I hope so too.
Moving on though to the bigger picture, as Christians, do our actions match our words when it comes to the value of family, when it comes to the value of children? Julian, you can speak to this. You know, do our actions match our words?
I have a confession to make. When Mike and I got married, we prayed about a lot of things: where we should live, what job we should take, different things like that. Should we get this car or that car? We misheard on one of those prayers because we did go ahead and buy a 1992 Ford Escort, which was really a bad choice. But we were praying about several things in our lives and felt very Christian for doing so. Do you know what we never prayed about in early marriage for years? Was, God, what size family, what people do you have for us as we build a family? We never considered that. We were real busy telling God about the family that we thought we could handle, the family we thought we could afford, what our friends were doing, on and on and on. Now, I don't have anything prescriptive for what God intends for each family, but it changes the conversation. Just as you were saying, to how we value children in our culture. Are we praying about, God, would you show me beyond maybe what I thought I wanted as a kid, or what I thought I wanted in terms of what I thought I could manage with career and kids and all the things? Who's supposed to be part of our lives? Who do you have for us? And I think this can go both ways. I know people who have wanted really big families, and as it turned out, God had for them one or two people. And I've known other people who were very resistant to having more than one child or two children. And as it turned out, God had something a little more chaotic in mind for them.
Which, Julie, by the way, tell those who are listening how many children you have.
So we have 8 kids. And I will tell you straight up that my husband's marriage proposal was something along the lines of, will you travel the world with me? Will you do this with me? And basically not have kids. Like, just maybe a cat, maybe. And so we started off in that way, very much devoted in our relationship to God, but not really. And both of us valued family, Cissie. It wasn't that. And I loved kids. But it just wasn't something that I had really ever seen exampled as something that you pursued with God, that you asked God for his guiding in that. So I would say that's something that we still are not modeling well for a lot of young Christians and young marriages today, is taking that pause to say, hey, we talk about our personal dreams for family, but shouldn't God be part of that conversation? Shouldn't God be part of that leading? Because it could look different. His best for us could look different than what we think. And again, I always want to be careful here because I've seen some people take this and it's, well, people should have huge families. Or if we really care about other communities that don't have enough, people who love God should have really small families. I do not have the wisdom for that. But I do know that we can start by saying, okay, God, show me, put the people in my path, show me what you have for me. Let me be open to your guiding in what it means to build a family and build a generation for you.
I can remember being, in high school, and I made this comment that said, oh, if I can afford it, I want 4 kids. And if it's too expensive, then I just want 2 or 3. And this girl, she's not a believer, doesn't come from a Christian home. She goes, why would you say that? She goes, my family doesn't have a lot of money and we have 5 of us and I wouldn't change that for the world. And I was just like struck that even at a young age by that comment. And as I've gotten older, we've kind of talked about this here before on Fearless, that we have allowed the American culture to kind of redefine this, this viewpoint of how we look at our families, even as Christians. And we've allowed it to have an influence on our lives and our decision-making, whether we realize it or not, based on, how much it costs per child. I can't remember. I should have looked that up. I did look that up one time, just on the recent episodes of Fearless, how much it costs to raise one kid in America. But Julie, you're right. We never go to God like, God, how big would you want our family? How do you want our family to look like? And surrender our hearts before we come up with all this list before we go to God about it.
I've said to people, go ahead, Casey.
I was going to say, you mentioned, do our actions line up with our words and what we say we believe? And I would say a non-believer's biggest critique, at least in America, is that they often look at believers as hypocrites, that we are saying one thing and doing another, and that's across the board on all of our values. But I don't know that many people talk about that in the family area. I think we think we're doing a good job, but we probably are blending in more with general culture than standing out as different. And you may have this later in your notes, Cissie, but I know you and I have talked often about like something as small as kids' sports. We put our kids in all the sports because it's a good thing to do. But, have we skipped church sometimes because somebody had a ball game? We've done that before, and that's a hard decision to make. And processing that and standing on our values is something that is real. It's an everyday factor for me. And I don't think our family has fully lived out what we say we believe. And culture sees that and uses that as a reason to call Christians hypocritical and not use us as an example of how they want their families to function. So I love that we're talking about this. And I think it's not as intense as other issues in the Christian culture, but it might be more important is what I'd say to this group. Like it might be more real and stumbling blocks for people who see us and say, they're just like us. They do everything just like we do. Why would I need to believe what they believe if I'm practically living the same lifestyle as them with my family? And that's convicting to me when I think about that.
Yeah. And I just want this to be a time of reflection for people when it comes to our families. How are we making sure our kids are valued? And if there's a bride coming up or, just to rethink maybe what do you want to teach? What do you want your legacy of your wedding to be? And so here's another subject when it comes to children. Let's talk about church, kids inside the main service, because I could argue both ways. I have gone to a Calvary chapel for many, many years. If you've been to a Calvary chapel, they have strict rules. I can't remember if it's 8 and under. Kids are not allowed into the main service. They have an area for nursing moms and for little ones if you want to stay with your children, but they provide a childcare or Sunday school. And I can argue that. I'm a very big opponent because then I've been to the opposite where everybody wants to bring their children into big church. And it is the biggest distraction. Moms up and down, coming and going. But maybe that's how church is meant to be. You know, when I've been in the middle of Africa and moms have walked miles and miles with their babies on their back, of course their children are in the church. So let's just throw that out there. I'm going to ask one of you, what do you think about kids in Sunday school versus big church?
I got thoughts. I got
Go,
lots
Julie.
of thoughts. And I'm like you, Cissie. I have experienced both. I see the logic behind some of it. I've been on church staffs where, very much like a lot of modern weddings, we are creating a big production. And it is a production in which the distraction or kids running up and down or somebody getting upset, the production would be interrupted. Now, today, I can tell you this. One of the reasons I think we see a younger generation struggling to transition into church for themselves as a habit as they reach adulthood is we have segmented off so successfully that they have no context or experience in what we would call big church. And yet somehow we think that they're supposed to go from the bubble machines and all of this activity that's supposed to keep them going and the youth group experience and all that. We think somehow they're supposed to transition from Disney World antics over to something that might feel a little more staid, a little more, great music and that kind of thing, but needing to sit still, if you will, for the message and the teaching from the word. So we're not giving our kids the advantage of onboarding what the experience is. I'm so drawn to what I see in Jewish culture when it comes to the bar mitzvah, that there comes a point at which, much earlier than in our Western culture, you're expected to spiritually walk into your own and to become an adult within the family. We don't do that. We protect those formative years as a second childhood. And so we're not even entrusting to our kids and saying to our kids, I trust you to be part of this experience and to learn how to come alongside the rest of the community. One thing that I've experienced now that's really interesting, over the last couple of years, I've been attending a church which is very much in the lane of the kids being with us during praise and worship, during the reading of the word, during the communion service. And they do, under a certain age, if they want to, they leave for the sermon time. So they're in the service, then they leave for the sermon time to go have that very same message that the minister is giving, broken down for them in a more age range that feels more, accessible to them. And then they come back in. I will tell you, having been part of a church that really had everybody segmented out and really protecting that space, but now attending where I get to see these kids and I get to see my granddaughter be welcomed to stay with me. I keep taking pictures when she and my daughter and my son-in-law are in town and we all go to church together, because it's just so meaningful to me to have these three generations set together during a service. There's something I think we've missed, just like within the wedding situation you were talking about. When we segment to that level, it's almost like we're saying that Jesus isn't for all of us in the same measure all the time or something. It's a very strange, I don't think that's what we intend to say. But when the production level, when the production value supersedes the value of the children that Jesus said, welcome the little children, let them come to me, he's saying there is value and lesson for you as the grown-up in being distracted. There is lesson and value for you in the production getting interrupted. You are above that. You're a grown-up. You can handle it. This is part of the messiness of training up the next generation. Is the distractions, the mess, the crayons on the floor. That's all part of it. They're not going to automatically get it like the flip of a switch when they go from the oonce of the youth group club next door, and now they're in big church, quote unquote, with us. There's got to be a better onboarding process, I think. Yeah.
The only thing, first of all, she's very fired up about this, Cissie. So
I know, I'm glad I asked.
I love it. And this is why we love having Julie with us on the podcast, because she usually behind the scenes has given us some good opinion here. But I would just add that first of all, my kids are 10 and 7. I have a boy and a girl, 10 and 7. And we've hit the age where my wife and I start to ask them, hey, today, do you want to come to big church? Do you want to go to kids' church? because I think there's something at that age. Now, below that, maybe it doesn't work, but that age where I'd like for them to have an opinion. I'd like for them to have a choice. And often they do want to come to big church with us. And because they made that decision, we notice that they tend to try their best to act a little, more, behaved. But I like that they're getting to have an opinion about church and to show a care for church, because I don't think we give them that pretty much at all in church. It's sort of like, go to this corner of the building, do whatever the person says, and then we'll come pick you up. And yet I want my children to participate in church and feel like it's a second home to them. So I think that's been a huge change for us over the last year. And if your church doesn't welcome children into the service, I would just add, I don't think that makes your church evil. I don't think that means they have an ill intent. And I know none of us have said that, but you might walk away listening to this feeling like, gosh, what's wrong with my church or my community? I do think we as members of our churches should speak up more in our churches and say, have we considered this? Would we be more lenient? And one easy ad that our church did a few years ago is, and I think I've said this to you, Cissie, is every month that has a fifth Sunday, they make it like all families. There is no kids church. And that was an easy step to set expectations for people and give them a good onboarding, and sort of take the choice out of the parent's hand. Like, we want our kids to experience this, even if in a small dose a few times a year. And that's been super helpful and has set some stage for younger kids to start coming to church more often. So that may be something, if you're listening, that you could talk to your church or pastor about.
Yeah. And I've realized when I just asked this question, this could have been a whole episode stand on its own, because there are a lot of different factors. Mm-hmm. And as I said earlier, I can see value to both sides of it. Yeah. Julie, I've gone to a church in Fort Myers before we moved that, yes, the kids sat through the music and through the prayer and the scripture reading and then left for the main service. But now we're up here, which is a whole different dynamic, because we've been attending a church where they don't have enough church volunteers, which is sad to say, and that could be a message on its own. But there is no Sunday school for the first service. And so my kids have been sitting in main church. And Austin, my son, who's 8 years old, to kind of Casey's point, he goes, Mom, I like it. I like sitting in there and listening. And so this should have been an episode. We might have to revisit this, because Julie, you were on fire. But I think there's value to both. And that is not to an attack to any church. And one of the factors is, how do parents discipline their children now? Because I do see kids up and down and going to get the coffee and going to the bathroom. My kids know, hey, when church starts, you're not getting out of your seat. I don't care if you have to go to the bathroom. You're going to hold it. It is a holy time. And I do want to remember people, when we are at church, it is holy. And to be setting that example for our kids, and to remember that it's not up and down and going to get crazy things. And that comes in stages, as Julie said. It doesn't just happen with the switch of a light, but it is setting that standard to our kids. Our kids are capable of sitting through it and teaching and talking about it later. But I've often said, when it comes to family, that our kitchen table is our greatest mission field. And that's based on the Psalm when it says, children are like olive shoots around our table. And olive shoots have a certain time to develop before they start producing themselves. And we have our kids for a certain time. But something I've been noticing, as I've said that, and I've taught it, and I've kind of preached it here on Fearless as well. If I'm going to preach it, of course, that's where Satan comes and starts attacking my family, is around the kitchen table. All chaos breaks out at kitchen table. And I cannot tell you in the last 2 weeks how many fights, how many arguments we have been at the kitchen table. And I looked at Corey the other day and I said, Corey, this is our valued time. This should be the most important part of our day. And we allow Satan to win. And I was like crying, because we'd sent our daughter off to bed without dinner. You're done. You're out of here. And we become so easily distracted. We allow Satan to distract us, whether it's the little things like our kids don't like the food and you're arguing, or you got a teenager who's got an attitude and you're arguing with that. So I'm asking Julie, who's raised 8 kids, what would you tell Casey and I, we're kind of in critical times. We don't, I still have a baby. Casey doesn't, but in this middle age group, where this is a critical time, what are some disciplines? What could we be doing with our kids to make, or as parents, this sacred time around our table?
Well, in full disclosure, there are times that I think we've really nailed it. There have been times that have been exactly, just wildness. And some of it too, even if there's not conflict at the kitchen table, there's a competitiveness for the schedule of the kitchen table. And we certainly had that experience where it was everybody going 27 different directions. And it was just, hey, grab some cereal when you have a chance kind of a thing. I think one of the first things that I had to make adjustments for, now, again, the age span of my kids is significant. So we had lots of different schedules that we were trying to work through. Part of what we did is we began to actually not make the kitchen table time unassumed for every day. We started making it like a special event kind of moment. So I started, for example, particularly as I had kids launching, we started doing a Saturday morning brunch that was a really special time that I put a little more effort into and that we made a little bit more set apart. Another thing that we used as a tool that was really helpful to us, and I credit a couple of my kids with being really militant about this, is we had a variety of discussion cards, and we still use these today, even with the 3 that are home, called Chat Pack. And the thing that was, there are different brands, there are different ones that you can find. Cissie, you probably need to put one out there for your listeners. And what was really fun about that is instead of letting the conversation roam, which sometimes, particularly when our kids are in those really formative years of middle school, early high school, where they're starting to really feel those ways that they want to make their own independence known. And sometimes it's a good thing. We do have to release them little by little. That's good. But it gives a guided conversation. It gives a time of reflection, whether that's, Cissie, you getting to talk about a memory of the first time that you ever got to do whatever. It gives kind of a guided course so that you're not just showing up at the table hoping that it's going to go well. You're actually with a plan. We're going to chat about this. We're going to talk about that. That's an interesting memory. And then to each of the kids, what's your first memory of that, or whatever the topic might be? We found that to be really helpful as well. Another thing that we've always held in high value that, honestly, guys, I did not realize how important this was until now, because here's what happens. Your kids get older and they come back to you with notes and feedback. So you're like, oh, so that didn't work. And then you have things you go, oh, that worked? Like that was something strategic? That wasn't strategic, but I'm so thankful for God's grace that made an impact. One of the things I've realized now is the way God designed our brains. When we associate certain things with certain times and places, it gets really embedded, right? So, Cissie, you're right on point in terms of really protecting that time around the kitchen table. And I would say wrapping it, obviously, in conversation about spirituality, but also making sure there's laughter there. I always loved that we were a family that laughed together. I'm telling you, the gift and the glue that laughter is to our families that God gives us. There's something about sitting around a table, laughing yourself into tears with the favorite soup of the family and the favorite dessert, the relaxation, the way God created our brains to feel bonded when we laugh together. There's something really powerful about that. So I would say, in addition to a chat pack and having some ideas what you want to talk about, add in there a dad jokes book and read through a couple of jokes a night. Just some little things where you sprinkle in and you're layering in, just like the recipes you're bringing to the table. You're layering in places of feeling bonded, places of feeling connected, talking about what the values are, hearing what your kids are struggling with. All those things layered together are what make the kitchen table truly successful. And so that intentionality, I would say, it's not just about gathering up at the same time every night to have the casserole. It really is about thinking through, what do we want to happen at this table? What do we want our kids to look back on and say, oh man, the nights that we would sit around and we'd start laughing and telling stories, and I learned this about mom and I learned this about dad. Those are the moments really that they're going to carry forward.
And Casey, you had said something when we were talking about this about how silly are these distractions going to be when we look back?
Well, when we started talking about this, I started just feeling like isn't it funny when we look back maybe 5 years or 10 years and like how, like to my silly story earlier, how devastated we were to find grandpa sticking his finger in the chocolate fountain. And now 14 years later, sorry, I look back on that and it's just kind of a funny thing. And it was not a big deal at all in the grand scheme of life. And I think about some of the reasons we might have skipped dinner at the dinner table, even in the last week. And I'm convinced that 10 years from now, my wife and I will look back and be devastated that like we let a ball game on the TV keep us from pausing and sitting at the table together or whatever that little thing may be. They're not all, like kids being sent to their room, although that does happen in my house too. But I just think we're going to look back and think that these things that seem big right now were incredibly small and probably be a bit embarrassed that we didn't fight through it and make the space that Julie's talking about. I'm trying to put myself in the future and live out what Julie's saying, because Julie, your kids are a bit older, and I'm sure you can look back on specific memories and moments that happened. Probably not all of them, but you probably remember a lot of those sweet moments and very few of the like chaos moments individually. And that's what I've heard from other parents. Julie, is that ring semi-true for you?
Absolutely. The thing that's wild to me is when you let something marinate over time, what was chaos becomes comedy. I can't explain it, but Grandpa dipping his finger in the chocolate fountain is a perfect example. That is hilarious. And I understand why it was not hilarious at the time. Those are the things that I remember so much at this point and that the kids remember is some of the moments that I thought were the most chaotic, the most off the rails are the things we laugh the hardest about today. And obviously, in all of our lives, there are things that are never going to be funny, that are hard, that are difficult, that are really challenging. But I would say there's such a big percentage of the stuff that we onboard day to day is, oh, this is so stressful and what's going to happen and what about this tale and it just doesn't even matter. It either evaporates, Casey, to exactly what you're saying, or it becomes something that ultimately becomes a great family story, family lore. You know, the reason that family lore, family stories are important and the reason they stand out is because it was the stuff that didn't necessarily go to plan. It was the stuff that went off a little bit. Those distractions are always going to come. It's how we frame those distractions. It's about what we really allow to seep through in terms of distraction. And the biggest one that I think we fight today for all of us is outside groups, affinity things, extracurricular activities dictating so much of our family time. And none of those things are bad. That's what's sneaky about it. They're great. We want our kids to excel and try things and follow their passions. But they're the things that we often don't guard against. We think about things that are a lot scarier, sin issues, content we don't want them watching, and we should be thinking about those things. But it's sometimes the things that are really seemingly benign that can take the biggest bite of the chunk out of our time together as families. And what I can tell y'all for sure, I know people say this, I know it's cliche, I am still shocked at how fast it all really went. There are only so many seasons that everybody's in your house and you have an opportunity to gather every day in some way, whether that's the breakfast table, the dinner table, whatever it is. It goes really fast. It moves really, really fast.
And I think Corey and I have been having those discussions when I look at Margaret, and I think I have 7 more years with her in my home. Mm-hmm. And she'll be a teenager driving soon, so she won't be home for dinners and certain things. And it flies by that all those things about your grandma or mom used to say about time, you realize are all coming true. And one habit that we do around our table, and I've shared this here before in Fearless, is called our peaks and our pits around the table. We each have to say one thing, the worst thing of the day. However, the only rule is that pit, the worst thing of the day, can't be about somebody else at the table.
That seems fair.
And your peak. And we end on the peak because I want to end on the praise and the best thing of your day. So that is one little thing we do around our table. But it has been a season with lots of distractions and dealing with attitudes and hormones and emotions at our table. And I haven't handled it well. And I really want to fight for it. And I want those who are listening, fight for your family. And that's been the whole point of this conversation is the value of family, reevaluating how you look at your children, not just to go have a night out with your spouse and fun and a party and at a wedding, but to take that time to teach your children, time in the church and to teach your kids, like as Julie said, going from the bubble machines to church and having a relationship with Jesus. It just doesn't happen. It's something we have to continually fight for and teach and discipline. But then even around our table and our car rides, our car time with our children is one of the greatest mission fields. And Julie, I've shared with you, and I didn't share that. I'll share her podcast at the end of the episode, but God on the Go is one of my kids' favorite podcasts, and it's short and sweet, and we can listen to it on the way to school. And when we lived in Florida, we had a 20-minute drive, and I value that time with my kids. We would turn on praise and worship. We would listen to your podcast. My kids love it. Oh. And then we would always end in prayer before we would go into school. Well, now that I live in Boone, school is literally 2 to 3 minute car drive that I'm still heated that my son forgot his lunchbox and his backpack, and I told him 10 times. And by the time we pull into the parking lot, that time is gone. So our car rides are precious. And I'm just telling that to listeners, fight for the time with your family, how your kids will look and value family and family time, because man, our enemy, Satan, will use time against us. Time is a precious resource. We don't get it back. And I've seen it over and over in my family, something that we are currently having to fight for in our own family. And to lead that up to, before we close, Thanksgiving is here. The holidays are here. And so we are going to be around a lot of family. I hear people, I don't want to be around family or something. But once again, make sure we value family and not to get caught up in the never ending to-do list, but to really set just, even if it's just 2 or 3 valuable moments with your family. And Casey or Julie, as we go into Thanksgiving, what are some ways that you look with your children that you might do differently in the next couple of years, or that you want to change? Because I don't believe, we've talked about this, Casey, it's not too late to correct some of these habits, or it's not too late to correct things that we might have been doing wrong and to reevaluate. But as we go into the holiday season with our kids,
I think two things came to mind during this discussion for me. One is, I think culturally Christians are just too serious about everything. Like, we should just have more fun, to Julie's point. Yeah. I hope my kids look to their parents and their grandparents, and like, we are joyful people, and that we're not so stuck in all the issues. Cissie, you and I talk about this all the time, because it's very difficult with Fearless to bring in a lightheartedness, because the things we talk about are so serious. They are so impactful and intense. And I heard you mention, 60,000 people requesting the election prayer guide this fall, and people are concerned about the big issues of our time. And yet, how do we infuse some joy back into our daily lives? And Thanksgiving can be very intense for people, including our family, who you look across the table at an empty seat, or, there's a lot of things that can be going through people's mind. But to use this as a moment to remind our kids that our family is filled with joy. And the second thing really quickly is, I feel convicted, not just by this conversation, but others I've been having recently, that our kids need to be participating in these things, not be handed, here's what you do, here's how you act, here, listen to the prayer before the Thanksgiving meal, but like, actually be a part of these things and offering them a chance to choose to be a part of these things. Because as they get older, Cissie, you and I's kids are generally the same age. They want to choose. They want an opinion. So let's give them a chance to choose to sit down at the dinner table with us, choose to participate in the prayer before Thanksgiving meal, or whatever those things may be, those habits, or even ask them, would you bring something fun to the table before I think all those things would be incredible. An incredible next step for a lot of parents with kids kind of pre-teen age, maybe even into the teenage world a little bit. So those are the two things I'm feeling pretty heavily. And this always happens to me when I talk to Julie. So I'll leave the rest up to Julie. But
we're
Julie,
all inspired when we talk to Julie.
Yeah.
Well, when I think about Thanksgiving and upcoming and the ages and seasons that my kids are in now, I look back a little bit and I'm like, man, I want to recapture something that I think I did a little bit better in the chaos of having so many little kids at the house than I have now. I am now weirdly defaulting sometimes to a certain degree to that production level again. Now, I want the grandbaby to have the best time ever. And like I set up all these little toy places for her to play and all kinds of things like that. But I'm also wanting to serve my kids at a level that is potentially going to chip away at some of the fun if I'm not careful. Because there were things that I felt like when I was in the ages and stages that y'all are in right now with your families. Oh, you just wait. One of these Thanksgivings coming soon. I'll make the perfect Thanksgiving. It won't be this chaotic. I'll actually get to that recipe I was going to try. I will actually iron the napkins, that kind of thing. Well, I think we always still have to be on guard because even now, I am sometimes robbing my kids of a chance, my adult kids of a chance to serve. So I think back to a Thanksgiving many years ago when I was stressed out. Thanksgiving was at my house and my in-laws were coming and my grandmother-in-law, my husband's grandmother, was going to be there, Grammy. We loved Grammy. And I'm telling y'all, Cissie, Casey, the house was as clean as it could be for where we were at the time. And I did iron the napkins and I fretted and I cooked and I baked and I did all the things. Now, I did have the kids do this, and this could be fun for your kids. We printed up things that we were thankful for each person who was going to be at the Thanksgiving table. And some of them were hilarious and some of them were sweet. And so before we began the meal, we sat there and one of my daughters was about 6 years old at the time. And I sat her next to her great grandmother, my grandmother-in-law, my husband's grandmother, Grammy. And we go around the table and everybody reads what they're thankful for. And I noticed that my daughter McKenna continues to look up at Grammy. She just keeps, and I'm like, what is she doing? Like, we are in the moment. This is a sweet moment. We are talking about all the things that we're thankful for, and the napkins have been ironed. Like, come on, get with the program. And in the middle of this, McKenna gets up and leaves the table, and I can hear her go back into my bathroom and start rummaging around in a drawer. And I'm like, I am just gonna, I can't believe this kid is messing up the perfect Thanksgiving that I have worked so hard. So I'm waiting for her to come back in. She comes back in. She sits down again. We're continuing to go around the table and I'm thankful because Papa's this and I'm thankful because Mimi's that. And I look and quick as a flash, McKenna whips out a pair of tweezers that she has gone to my bathroom and retrieved. And she plucks a chin hair off of Grammy's chin. Y'all, I had worked so hard to make this Thanksgiving the perfect Thanksgiving. I was appalled.
I wasn't expecting the story to go there, Julie.
You know, that's what you get with me, chin hair. And so I was just floored. I couldn't believe it. But then following so quickly on the heels of that, Grammy she could just play the straight man to any situation. She just turned and she said, well, I'm thankful that I don't have that chin hair anymore. And it just like took us all down. I am so mindful of that again, the joy of that Thanksgiving, that yes, there was preparation. There was a standard that I wanted to set. There was a level to which I wanted to serve my family at a certain point. But there was also this beautiful elbow room for the unexpected, for kids to do the things that they do, like Georgia Graham out on that dance floor all night. Wow, what gifts from God. When God says that we are his children, those are some of the things that he takes the greatest delight in when we do the things that are just, a little wacky and a little out there. So I think back to that Thanksgiving and it inspires me again to go, I want to make sure I'm leaving elbow room for the good stuff, for life, for all the things that I'm really thankful for.
Yeah. And just to that note, before we end, I think my takeaway here is that we are so often guilty of wanting things to be perfect, all the way from a wedding to our kitchen table to the Thanksgiving table of family, that when things don't go our way, we're so quickly to get upset. But to leave that elbow room to you, as what you said, is our children bring us joy. And that's what we have to remember, that the kids also themselves bring a lot to the table, not just adults, and to allow that to happen. And that's a challenge for me. That was a challenge in this conversation that I wanted to have today, which is as we approach the holidays, how can we reevaluate the value that we allow our children to bring? And Thanksgiving, when I was a child, Christmas wasn't my favorite holiday. It was Thanksgiving, because we sat around our family table with my dad's parents, and every year we went around the table, and children included, to what you said, is we had to talk about what God had done in our year that year, the hardships, the good times, and what we were thankful for. And as a kid, I had to sit there, and I even had to say it myself as a little one. And I value those moments with my grandparents and three generations around the table. And so allow the elbow room around your kitchen table, as Julie would say, and just let this be an encouragement of how we look at our children this holiday season and different aspects in our life and our daily routine, and not to be easily distracted. As Casey would say, and these distractions are going to look so silly when we look back. If our kids are arguing about what we cooked, to something they said in the car that made us mad and we're making them sit in silence, or whatever it is. I mean, of course, we have to discipline our children and train them up the way they should go. And I've realized I have opened up so many things that could be a conversation here on Fearless that I really thought this was going to be a short conversation. I thought it was going to be like 20 minutes. I didn't expect it to be this long. So thank you, Casey and Julie. Thank you for what you've meant to me and to this Fearless team. And as we close, I just want to say, Julie, you do have a couple of podcasts. Tell people where they can get those podcasts.
So there's the All Mom Does podcast, and you can check that out at allmomdoes.com or find it wherever you get your podcast. There's God on the Go. Like Cissie said, it's just 5 minutes for parents and kids in the car, going to soccer practice, all the things. But it's a conversation starter about our very good and great God. And it's a way for parents to engage and kids to be able to talk about their faith.
That's all. Hey, by the way, I have a podcast too.
Oh,
it's called Fearless.
Yes,
I never
you do.
appear on it. And if you're listening, you should share it with somebody because it's awesome. And we love doing it with you, Cissie. So thanks for having us
My
on.
heart just stopped. I'm like, oh my gosh, how do I not know Casey's got a podcast? Yes, thank you, Casey. And he also produces many other great podcasts around the country. So thank you. And once again, thank you for all those who are listening on today's episode of Fearless. If you didn't catch those, I will put Julie's podcast in my show notes. But once again, thank you for joining me on another episode of Fearless. A little bit different, but I believe our family and the way we value our children is just, that is the bedrock to how we will face everything else in our culture.